Hello, and welcome to the third episode of Black Excellence in Higher Education. I am Kimberly York, Interim Director for Black Programs, and your host, and I'd like to introduce my co-host.
Hi everyone, my name is Ignacio Alvarado, and I'm a Student Engagement Specialist for Black Programs.
Today we have the privilege of sitting down with Mr. Roy Collins, who is our General Counsel here at NMSU. Mr. Collins, if you would, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, and thank you for inviting me, Ms. York and Mr. Alvarado. And I'll start with the typical lawyer comment. The views expressed in this interview do not necessarily reflect those of New Mexico State University. So you're saying, tell about myself. I'll give you some things about my home of origin. You asked about some talents and hobbies, etc. My home of origin, I'm actually one of three children born in Galveston, Texas, to my parents, Roy and Isola Collins, who themselves grew up as neighbors there in Galveston. Now, the day when I was born, that was my parents' fourth wedding anniversary. And that was less than a week after the end of the Montgomery bus boycott that had just begun a year before then.
Wow, so what was it like growing up in that time?
Well, I can tell you, Galveston this was, 50s and 60s, a reasonably calm place compared to other parts of the country, although there was definitely some presence of, social change. It was a community that had been well known for, believe it or not, the gambling industry, which by that time I was born was just ending. And so the city was, reinventing itself.
Nice, thanks for that.
So did you want to ask about talents and things, or am I getting ahead of this?
Yeah, go ahead. Feel free to ad lib.
Okay. So I think you asked about unique talents, and in my point of view, unique is in the eyes of the beholder. Two of my talents that I can think of are music and public speaking. So as to music, I was born just a few years after my mother had completed her master's degree in music. So I ended up surrounded by musicians that were either family members or friends of the family. So naturally, I tried to imitate what I saw. And before I even reached first grade in elementary school, I was able to read music and play piano and trumpet. In my adult years, I spent a lot of time performing vocal music as a member of the chorus in some faith-based settings, and even more recently serving as a soloist. Now, public speaking part, I've enjoyed several opportunities to do public speaking, whether for occasions related to the field of law or in a wide variety of faith-based congregational settings. Now, since I've been here at NMSU, most recently I've spoken to administrative groups on a wide range of legal issues that campuses face in managing the risks arising from COVID-19. And before then, I even spoke here to senior leaders on the subject of campus freedom of speech. And I adapted that from a presentation I did at my last institution.
Wow, that's incredible, Mr. Collins, especially to see that you've had this affinity and this ability to really work the crowd, if you'd say, really get the magic going. So if you don't mind me asking, since we now have like a scope for your talent, skills, and hobbies, so describe your role and work at NMSU. How does it all tie together? What are you currently working on as of right now?
I'll get to that. We didn't get to the hobbies though, but if you're interested, I'll do that, or we can go straight on.
We could make it a twofer. You could do your hobbies and then we can go into it.
Well, three hobbies that I've enjoyed over the years are barbecuing, gym training, and basketball. I'll start with barbecue because that's closest to my heart. That's one thing I inherited from my father, a love for the world of barbecue, whether as a cook or just eating it. Since I'm a Texan, I have really high standards for the flavor in barbecue. It has, by the way, little to do with barbecue sauce. It has more to do with how you marinate, prepare it, and you smoke it. Barbecuing for me is a lifelong journey. And even though I admit to being a barbecue snob, yes, I am, I'm never too proud to learn new techniques from somebody else. Now, another hobby, as I mentioned, is gym training. Until this pandemic shut down our gyms, you would regularly find me working out, usually in the mornings, doing weight training and aerobics. I would still do that now, but the gym is still closed. So then there's basketball. Until I injured my knee more than a decade ago, I usually kept active playing pickup basketball, occasionally other team sports, maybe softball or volleyball. But until my sons got to be teenagers And really by that time they knew better. They thought I had really good basketball skills, maybe at the same level of some of the athletes you see on TV.
Got a quick question. Do you have any favorite teams right now?
Well, I'm a bandwagon fan, so you can call me a Laker fan this year. And I should be a Houston Rockets fan, but they're a little troubled these years, so I'll just stick with the Lakers this year.
I don't blame you. That's my go-to if anyone should ask me.
And I think I should weigh in as a Clevelander. You can never go wrong banking on LeBron James.
Cleveland stamp of approval from Miss Kim. All right, so if you wouldn't mind, Mr. Collins, would you mind talking about what you currently do at New Mexico State University, what your role is here in this wild, wild west of academia?
Well, here I serve as general counsel and the chief legal officer at NMSU. Basically, I represent the main campus, plus all 4 community colleges and the New Mexico Department of Agriculture. Now, my office has 2 administrative assistants and 4 attorneys, including me. I also oversee the Office of Institutional Equity and the Office of Athletic Compliance. Now, together, our job is to provide sound legal recommendations to the senior leaders at NMSU. Now, we help those leaders to manage the institutional risk, particularly in the most effective way. Now, if a party sometimes has a conflict or dispute with NMSU, my office does what it can to minimize any unfavorable consequences, and you can just imagine that. NMSU has a wide variety of initiatives and programs, and part of what we do in my office is to help strategize by recommending lawful ways for NMSU to get the maximum benefit as we create or enhance those programs.
Thanks for that. I have a 2-part question for you. And one is kind of piggybacking off of something that you've already shared, and that is kind of your background. Can you talk to us a little bit about what led you down the law path?
Sure. Now, some people would say that in life, there are no accidents. But in the beginning, I did not intend to make a career in higher education. And actually, I didn't set out at first to become a lawyer. My first degree is in mechanical engineering. Before I graduated college, I spent some of my pre-college and college years as a student intern at NASA Johnson Space Center. While I was a student intern, I met a few engineers who not only designed components that the Apollo astronauts used on the moon, but also that they designed parts of the space shuttle. So those engineers told me that they saw some things about my verbal skills that could help engineers and designers to get patents for their inventions. So once I graduated from engineering school, I worked in the aeronautical and aerospace industry doing some software simulation on the control systems and guidance systems used on fighter airplanes and the space shuttle. After a few years working as an engineer, I decided to shift and go to law school. And that was in the early 1980s. And back then, African Americans were still somewhat rare in the engineering field, and even more rare in the field of patent law. So this is to say that mentors for me in that career path were very few and far between. Plus, the patent firms and the legal departments in companies and agencies during the mid-1980s were not very receptive to hiring young Black lawyers. But by the early to mid-1990s, an opportunity came for me to use my patent and intellectual property skills at the Texas A&M University system. So it started with me first doing invention licensing to private companies, and later it switched to me managing the entire intellectual property portfolio of the A&M system. And even later, my role changed to providing intellectual property and contract support to A&M's engineering research programs. Now, during this same time, I began branching out as a lecturer, a trainer, and a workshop facilitator across the country on topics related to technology law and negotiation skills. After a while, a very wise recruiter brought me back to private industry, where I joined the legal department at the Chrysler Corporation. There I handled most of Chrysler's new engineering and intellectual property business deals. Now, years later, I returned to my home state of Texas for personal reasons. And at first, I was working with two different startup technology companies that came along. They wanted me to provide legal advice. But after a while, I decided to get back to the 8 to 5 workplace as part of the legal department at Texas Southern University in Houston. That began a new journey that has continued for the past 17 years or so, serving as an in-house attorney to higher education institutions. After Texas Southern, I was recruited to Idaho State University, and then the University of Hartford, based in Connecticut, and now New Mexico State University. So it's been so long that I no longer see being in higher education to be an accident.
Wow, that's pretty impressive, to say the least. Can you talk a little bit about the skill sets and the just the strategies that you use to navigate? You talked about that there were very few Blacks in the field at the time when you were entering. Can you talk a little bit about how did you navigate not having a clear roadmap or role models?
Well, I can't say that it was a pretty journey. There were a lot of fits and starts, but I eventually found that I could learn quite a bit from participating in the National Bar Association, which is the oldest African American legal organization. It goes back to the time when African Americans were not welcome into the American Bar Association, and it's still a very vibrant organization. And I found that there were other African Americans who were interested in intellectual property and patent law. And so many of them were generous with their time and gave me some advice. Some of them were able to make great strides. And over the years, I just learned the power of networking. You spend some time going to conferences and you talk to whomever you can talk to of any ethnic background. And you have to learn to decide what advice is going to fit you. So again, through much trial and error, that's kind of where it came.
Thanks for that. And so the second part of my original question kind of centers on, you talked about your role with OIE, and we know that on our campus, we are in the throes of hiring our first ever Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And I just wanted to get your perspective about this milestone.
It is quite a milestone. I can say that I've worked in higher ed for a while, and there's usually someone who has one role or another in the diversity space, the inclusion space. And what NMSU is trying to do is make sure that this person is at the most senior level, as a vice president rather than a director or some type, a program director. And this person is now going to be part of the senior decision-making world of the university, doing a lot of strategizing, having to do a whole lot of outreach, community-wise, campus-wise, making sure that a lot of things are being done that make sense for the 21st century. And that's really the key. The 21st century is not the 20th. There's so much that we've learned, and we know about the population projections, things of that nature. Failure to have a strategic role in diversity, equity, inclusion is probably not going to be the most competitive thing. If you really want to compete, you're going to have to make sure that you're making the best use of human resources and opportunities on many fronts.
Thank you for that, Mr. Collins. So I want to take the question to more just encompassing, your career and where you are now. It's very obvious that you've had a very illustrious, you have a very illustrious, prestigious career. So I just want to know, whether it's from the perspective of engineering, from the perspective of law. So what would you say was the most significant learning experience from your educational and professional journey?
The most significant lesson that I've learned is that it pays not to consider yourself uninvited to the party just because no one begged you to come. Now, we all know about imposter syndrome and microaggressions that leave a lot of us as people of color feeling unwelcome or underappreciated. But life has taught me never to assume that what I bring to the table is any less important or valuable than anything anyone else brings. The value of that lesson was clear, particularly during my time at Chrysler Corporation. Instead of being second guessed or devalued by my colleagues and coworkers there, I found most of them to give great deference to the expertise that I had. Some people said to me there that if I had made it to Chrysler, knowing all the obstacles that people of color experience in learned professions, I must be smart. But that lesson built upon another learning experience from my college years when I transferred from a majority white University of Houston to Southern University, which is an HBCU land grant institution in Louisiana. That's my alma mater. Now, at the University of Houston, I was considered to be in a so-called minority group, but I was in the majority at Southern University. And if anybody at Southern might be referred to as a minority group, it would be the students from Iran who were a very prominent part of Southern's College of Engineering. Most of the Iranians at Southern held back from participating in campus activities or campus organizations, much in the same way that I did when I was at the University of Houston. So I asked some of them, why? Why are you holding back? And I learned that they didn't feel welcome as part of the university's mainstream, whether socially or in professional organizations. Now that reaction was a surprise to me because the typical student at Southern was likely to be very hospitable to the Iranians or anybody else. And a lot of us enjoyed learning words, for instance, and expressions in the Persian and Farsi language from them. But it didn't occur to many of us that the Iranians felt a need for any kind of special invitation before they were going to join into campus life or outside from classes or study hall. But that was a lesson that taught me something when I entered the workforce, not to assume that my presence in the so-called mainstream activities was unwelcome, or even resented, or even a shock to anyone. Of course, it's obvious that some non-Black people were not accustomed to seeing Black people in senior roles that have little to do with diversity or ethnic identity. But through experience, I've learned my power. My power is to keep focused on the major business at hand, which is all that any sane people are going to care about in the first place. Now, this principle.
I really appreciate that last statement. My power is to stay focused. What would you say, what piece of advice would you have for any young Black person or student or other persons of color that are endeavoring to either pursue engineering or law right now? What piece of advice would you give to them?
Well, first of all, do it because you love it. And if you don't know that you love it, at least try it out. The only way you're going to find out what you like is involvement. A lot of us have these ideas from television shows of what certain occupations are like, but I don't care what you do, there's going to be some repetition, some drudgery, some work that you don't feel like doing. So you really have to have a love that gets you through those moments. And it's also love that's going to help you become really great. If you really want to be really great, you're going to have to spend some time. Now, working your way into certain those professions, you need to figure out what it's like. And if you can be involved in it, have an opportunity to be an intern or a summer work or whatever, you'll get a chance to see what people do every day. But then you just have to be persistent. Not everybody is going to be all that welcoming, but most people want what they want. And when you're in a workplace, what everybody wants is to get the work done. And you build your reputation, and then you move on. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And actually, if I could ask you to elaborate just a little bit about that imposter syndrome and how you, because I know that that is something that is very prevalent among our student leaders. And we just had a student leadership training on Saturday for all of the diversity student leaders. And one of the things that we had the Aggie Wellness, Health and Wellness Center talk about was that whole concept of imposter syndrome. And so I just wanted to know, if you could just elaborate on that just a little bit from your perspective.
Sure, just from my perspective. I'm not the expert when it comes to those topics, but just my own personal experience. There are so many negative images and messages that people have that they're really not always reinforced that they have value, that they are even, as I say, smart. The thing is, you can flip it either way. There's some people who don't know very much and they've overestimated what their abilities are. Somewhere in the middle is this happy zone where you're very competent, you're willing to learn, but you're also willing to be well, to be regarded well. And that, you have something to say. Many of us have inhibitions. I'm not the most talkative person in large groups. And those large groups eventually figure out, well, if he spoke, he must have had something important to say. And so you have to value yourself. You don't have to be the biggest extrovert. You don't have to be all those things. Know what you know and have some confidence in it. Study what you're going to talk about before you say. And you'll help yourself later, because people will value the next thing you have to say because you thought it out the first time. And if you're not right, be humble enough to say, well, I'm going to figure this out more. I want to talk a little bit also about this principle of inclusion, because it also applies to your own private life, your recreational life. I would say that my wife and I love and relish every opportunity to enjoy gatherings with what we call our skin folk. We luxuriate in that wonderful mosaic of humor, wokeness, cuisine, expressiveness, and solidarity that we call Black culture. But we also spend quite a bit of time in our spare moments at events and places that many African Americans rarely attend, where we find the environment to be much more inviting than we anticipated. I would say this, very few places that we've been are more welcoming than what we've experienced right here in New Mexico.
Being from Cleveland, Ohio, I would definitely echo that sentiment. I do feel that this is one of the most friendliest places that I've ever lived before.
Thank you. So if you don't mind, I want to kind of switch gears. So as you know, it is February, which is Black History Month. And I want to echo back to what you were saying earlier when it comes to, being resilient, perseverance. You can't wait for a special invitation to get into something. You can't wait for the barriers to be broken down. Sometimes, as my grandma said, you have to lay down your own welcome mat and open the door yourself, find a window if you have to, and just make yourself a seat at the table. So I want to ask, because, in our history, we've been very resilient with Dr. King, Shirley Chisholm, Rosa Parks. What is the significance of Black History Month for you? Do you have any traditions, and has your relationship with Black History Month changed as you've matured? I know it's a three-part question.
Sure. Well, in terms of significance of Black History Month, like any celebration of Black history, whether it be the full month of February or any time otherwise, that celebration provides an opportunity for centering, reflection, and even recalibration in context to what's occurred before and in honor of those people who've come before. Now, these special celebrations have the most critical purposes for African Americans because of this society's historic marginalization and devaluation of some of the most valuable people who've ever walked the face of this earth. Now, that's the tragic irony. So much effort has been expended to suppress this story and these people, and still we rise. The height of the civil rights movement happened during my early grade school years. During my high school and college years, some of the initial fruit of that movement was first being ripened. What was going on then at the time didn't feel like history, but in retrospect, you can reasonably consider it to have been an era of radical change. Now, both sides of my family lived and breathed Black history, but often the way we experienced that history was very personal relative to a larger narrative that was being experienced by Black families across the country. My family taught us the highs and the lows of the Middle Passage, the enslavement days, emancipation, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the Great Migration, and so forth, until the days in which I was born. Now, those lows were obvious. Things like the systematic state-sponsored terrorism, oppression, and brutality, or the pathologies that plagued landlocked rural communities and congested urban centers into which many folks escaped from that oppression in the southern states. But my family also made sure we knew about the highs, the heroes, the sheroes who overcame all kinds of adversity to make a difference. Many of those giants were my own ancestors, building churches, schools, and social action organizations that kept our communities not only livable, but also full of purpose. Now, I think you may have asked about traditions in Black History Month, and I have, so I can tell you about. One of them, I'll start with Juneteenth. Now remember, I'm a native of Galveston, Texas, and that's the city where the first ever Juneteenth celebration happened in 1865. Now the word Juneteenth has come to mean the 19th of June, remembering when federal troops landed by ship in the port of Galveston as a show of force after the Civil War ended to enforce. They had to be there to enforce the end of slavery in most of the southern United States. My ancestors on my mother's side came to Galveston in 1865, right when the Civil War ended. And some relatives on my father's side came to Galveston soon after that. So my sisters and I make the 5th generation of my family that lived in Galveston. And several generations of my family have had a role in leading Juneteenth celebrations, whether in Galveston or elsewhere. Now, even I've done that in Idaho and in Connecticut. Now, another tradition is Watch Night. That's a related tradition, and it happens on New Year's Eve. People in the Black community have different customs for celebrating Watch Night, whether in their homes as families or in worship centers as faith-based congregations. Now, this celebration of Watch Night has its origins within the enslaved and freedmen communities across the United States in anticipation of the Emancipation Proclamation, which Abraham Lincoln issued on New Year's Day of 1863 during the middle of the Civil War. Now, much is said historically about the political and even military strategy purposes for Abraham Lincoln to issue that proclamation. But African-American families, including my own, consider the heavy lifting of emancipation to have been done in prayer by people of color and those who consider themselves to be abolitionists otherwise. And yes, those are traditions I can tell you about.
Thanks for that, Mr. Collins. I wanted to circle back. You talked about the historical significance of Galveston and Juneteenth. And as you know, on NMSU campus last June, we celebrated the first ever campus-wide Juneteenth. I wanted to revisit and ask a question. I know that your family was very instrumental in making sure that you had the knowledge, the accurate knowledge about, historical Black and African-American figures. Can you talk a little bit about the educational system that you grew up in, and did you feel that that was adequate in empowering and educating you about your heritage?
It was a mixed bag, because when the early 60s came, remember Brown versus Board, we'll get to that later. That was in the mid 50s, but by the time I went to elementary school, it was the early 60s, and they were still just rolling it out, this idea of integration. And my experience was being that 1, 2, maybe 3 Black kids in the class, surrounded by Caucasians mostly, and some Latinos as well. And really, it was not what you call the strong pro-Black environment. I got on my pro-Black on weekends at church, in community activities. And so by the time I got to college, I could even get what we called conscious back then. I think you say woke now, but we said conscious then. And so in between that time, the strong reinforcement of history was something that was done in homes and in community organizations. I'm thankful that we had some people. One of our most beloved high school teachers, Mr. Weaver in my high school, was the one who led Black History celebrations. And it was done at great resistance at the time by the predominantly white administration, but we did have a Black History Month celebration there. And so, we had this dichotomy, we had this separation between what you do in your public world and what you do in your private world. In the private world, there was strong reinforcement of this history and the heritage that goes with it.
So along the similar lines, one of the questions that I've asked all of the previous guests is this whole notion of Black versus African American. Can you kind of weigh in on that from a personal perspective?
Okay, I'll say it this way. You say tomato, and I'll say tomato. Now the main thing is, that we take our own power to name ourselves. Historically, the people who held us captive and oppressed us have called us everything except a child of God. And unfortunately, a lot of us have internalized it with some insidious results. No ifs, ands, or buts. Nothing has ever made sense for us to use the N word for ourselves, whether it ends with an ER or an AH, because that's all a commercially driven rationalization, and I'm not buying it. So let's talk about Black. During my grade school years, we listened and joined the R&B legend James Brown in singing, "Say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud." And that was us taking our own power, because a racist society had designated everything negative as Black and everything positive as white. And we know that genealogically, what we call skin color has no real significance. But on the other hand, culturally, our heritage has a very profound meaning. But for us to take our power and proclaim Blackness as something to be proud of affirms our personhood on our own terms and acknowledges that God made us all in God's own image, as the song goes, red and yellow, black and white. So as we celebrate our Blackness, we take away any temptation to pass down to further generations a kind of knee-jerk reaction that many of our ancestors had trying to defend their humanity when somebody referred to them as being Black. Now then, African-American. Words like Afro-American, African-American have been around for as long as African people have lived here in the United States. That's nothing new. But that whole idea began to take on another meaning as the US immigration laws began to change over the past few decades, with a significant number of people now being permitted to immigrate to the US from Africa and the Caribbean region. It's now increasingly apparent that many experiences of Black people in America are resonant with many Black people who immigrated here from those other places. Now, for one segment here in the US, it was centuries of enslavement and Jim Crow. And for those other segments, it was centuries of colonialism and cultural imperialism. But as we connect the dots, and it's important to do so, we learn that the experiences here in the US, Africa, the Caribbean, were interdependent parts of a larger system that exploited Black people. No one can reasonably pretend that every experience of these segments is identical or not even necessarily congruent. Every situation is significantly different, but what we all share is deeper than the melanin in our skin. Our broad spectrum of brown hues symbolizes something far more intense and more significant than DNA. Connection we share is ultimately spiritual. So an expression like African American is a way to emphasize solidarity without any expectation of exact consensus. This solidarity invites a mutual discovery, and it honors our common ancestors. So we could use a science fiction law. You might even say that the expression African American conveys an historical reconciliation in the manner of Back to the Future, or even foreshadows a kind of Wakanda effect for generations to come. Now, more importantly, reconnecting with an African identity provides to us what it does for other ethnic enclaves in our society. It projects our own global identity. It disrupts an intentional estrangement that our captors tried in vain to create.
Thanks for that. So I have been doing a little bit of research. Unfortunately, growing up, I didn't really pay much attention and didn't have a vast perception about the relevance of Black history. And so I've been playing a little bit of catch up over the years. And so I graduated from my alma mater's Case Western Reserve University. And I recently learned that Fred Gray, who is an attorney like yourself, was very instrumental in being a part of the legal team for Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, and the NAACP. And so I just wondered if you could provide a context of how the important role of attorneys such as yourself play in this, all of this legalities when it comes to, equity and all of those kinds of things, just from a pragmatic standpoint.
Well, we all have our own Mount Rushmores, and when it comes to African American attorneys, Mount Rushmore has Thurgood Marshall, Charles Hamilton, Houston, any number of people like that, the Fred Graves, all those people were the folks who did the hard work. There was even one in my hometown, even in my neighborhood, Thomas Dent. And he was a major pioneer in the state of Texas in terms of the legal profession. Those are the people who, risked their lives just showing up into a courtroom. That was, actually something that could get you killed. It actually happened in open courtroom. I was told of a story, legend or true, in Brazos County, which is where Texas A&M is, that there was some African-American attorney who was making an argument, and the judge got so upset, he just shot him in the chest. Anyway, so things like that. So when you're talking about, pace setters, there's some people who have done the hard work, and the era that we refer to as the civil rights era, there were so many fundamental cases that were being done. Not just the Brown versus Board, there were cases that created Texas Southern University, Human Sweat, it was Sweat versus Painter, and that was a lawsuit just to get Human Sweat having an opportunity to study at the University of Texas Law School. But the law of the land was separate but equal. So what the state of Texas did was create Texas Southern University out of nothing, just to be able to say that it was an equal institution. Now we know, and it's a wonderful institution, I used to work there, but it's not the same thing as the University of Texas. And that model was used across the Jim Crow South. I'm a graduate of Southern University, and it was a separate but equal institution to Louisiana State University. That model was around. And so these attorneys were able to litigate these cases and make it so that people didn't have to travel across the country. I mentioned my mother getting a master's degree in music. She went to Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, because no Southern state was going to offer a graduate program. And there's a whole bunch of folk, my generation, whose parents went to these schools in the Big Ten region, and they were able to get graduate education because in the Southern states, that wasn't available to you. The lawyers who did this work went systematically. And so by the time you get to Brown versus Board, the country had to look at it somewhat differently, which is why, we have these different kinds of stories for what's going on with the generations now. NMSU has its own story. When we look at the Williams Avenue of someone who was able to break through the barriers, and now it's not an unusual thing to see African Americans here on campus, but you can bet it was then when Ms. Williams was there. These are our stories, and so there's a direct, hand in glove connection between what's going on in the courtroom and what's going on in our communities.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. So even though we've only just met today, I can tell right now I really appreciate how well versed you are in African American history and how much reverence you have for our legacy and our ancestors. And I want to know, I can only speak for my experience in my school system, but how should African Americans, younger generations, know more about the history? How can they learn more about it? Because from my experience, I didn't learn much about Black history and my ancestors growing up in school. It was something that was covered more as part of the curricula in February, but it was put away and you didn't hear about it till later on, maybe when you're growing up. So how would you give advice on younger students to know Black history?
There's so many things I can tell you with. One thing that a student who's coming along these days has, I didn't have when I was in school, was this thing called Google. And now you can just learn anything you want to with a word search. Now, the only problem is being able to curate what's on Google. In other words, there's a lot of misinformation on the web as well as good information. For that reason, it's always going to be valuable to pursue something like higher education because it gives you an ability to sift through what's valuable and determine what's useful for you. But if you don't have that, I still say start by looking at what's there. I believe some people are still showing up at libraries, and I would definitely invite anyone to visit their public library as soon as this pandemic lets up, and you can get all kinds of information there. Now, another wonderful thing we have, public broadcast, TV, you can get all kinds of Black history programs to get you started, but don't just watch them, take notes. And then you can spend the rest of the year, those 11 months of the year, learning more about whatever you've seen there. There's all kinds of ways. And one thing the universities like us can do, we can make sure that we have ongoing outreach, and we do have as part of our strategic goal is to have outreach. Well, we can do that. We can make sure that we're giving the K through 12 students an opportunity to be exposed to things, and we can make sure that we're giving them the body of knowledge through our own resources at nmsu.edu. There's all kinds of places that you can do it.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. I wanted to just add on to this, and I had this conversation with our previous guest. You mentioned about, access in education for our students. So just recently, I serve on Representative Cheryl Stapleton's committee for the Black Education Act. And so I would like to hear from you, just your perspective about what sorts of things do you feel would be important to include in such an act? It has made some momentum in both the House and Senate as it has unanimously passed. And so we've made some strides, but what would you say that we definitely should consider including in such an act that empowers students to have equal access?
Okay, I don't really claim to have had a role in reviewing the legislation, et cetera. And I don't claim to be an expert on education. We have people like Dr. Pichon here who can elaborate in great detail on things like that. But I would just certainly hope that a student is going to have access to, let's just say, a more dimensional view of African and Black history. When I say more dimensional, we're oftentimes fed these two-dimensional views. We hear I have a dream speech, and we don't hear the rest of Dr. King's speeches. We hear only about Dr. King and maybe Rosa Parks, but we don't hear about so many of the other people who we might refer to as soldiers. But there are any number of ways in which a person can attain it. Even in the area I mentioned, engineering and technology, if people knew more about what was going on from people of color, African Americans, in inspiring inventions in this country, it would change a whole lot. So if you can be, in other words, a techno nerd and find plenty of Black history. There's all kinds of places. We know about arts and entertainment. That's a wonderful thing, sports. But Black people have been involved in pretty much every aspect of a human endeavor where someone wasn't just holding the door shut. We have a lot that we can say and a lot that we can contribute. But I still defer to the Dr. Pichons on figuring out good curricular approaches.
Thank you. And yes, I agree with you. I just recently learned about that the inventor of the GPS as well as the ice cream scoop of all things were invented by both Black people. So yes, that leads me to my next question for you, Mr. Collins, and that is, who would you say would Black historical figures or even more recent inspire you?
Let's start with historical ones. There's so many powerful examples available to choose from, and in so many different critical areas. But one recently historical figure who's influenced me from afar is Nelson Mandela. Now, if you read his autobiography, The Long Walk to Freedom, then you may recall that his day job was that of a lawyer, primarily in Johannesburg in South Africa. And you may also recall that he was no ordinary citizen, even among the leadership of the African National Congress. He was also by birth part of a royal bloodline, independently of whatever his financial situation was, or even when he was incarcerated. The people there knew him as Madiba, both as an honorific and as a term of affection. But his life's calling was not just to be head of state, that he's famous for. Before he became president of South Africa, Nelson Mandela was already a public official, grounded in the wisdom of his people and devoted to their welfare. As a child, he was reared to be a counselor to his ethnic group's most senior royalty. Now, he had a law degree, and having a law degree and membership in the bar was just a means to make ends meet, but also it was a way to pay bills. But beyond that, he was a trained counselor in the highest sense of the word, even to the point of having some of the people from his own ethnic group visiting him in prison because they needed him to settle disputes among them. So Mandela would be my guy. Now, modern day, among living individuals, my own offspring inspire me. Now, each one of them is at a different stage of young adulthood. but each of them has exceeded perhaps even their own expectations during the trying times that we're living in. My youngest is in his mid-20s, and he's learned to take care of not only himself in managing this pandemic, but also a whole group of senior citizens where he works and where his employer is entrusted to provide sensitive care. Now, his older brother is a psychiatrist in training who does nationwide outreach on mental health needs, and he has expertise on managing high maintenance diseases. And their older sister has joined her husband in mobilizing a faith-based congregation in a major urban center through innovative online resources and medical outreach in their vicinity. And she is a physician herself at the front lines during this pandemic.
Wow, I'm impressed. I can see how they inspire you. And I guess I should throw in a shameless plug here. So you mentioned that one of your sons is a psychiatrist in training. And so we are having on February 26th, we are having the Black Mental Health Matters. And I wondered if you might be able to arrange to get him to join us.
I can certainly invite him, and I hope he'll have a chance to see this podcast too.
I'm hoping so too. So if you can join us, we are wholeheartedly welcoming and would love to have you. So the next question that I would like to ask you, how would you say that you use your talent, skill, experience to leverage resources and support for students?
Sure. Now, what goes on in your life influences whether or how you can empower students. What's going on in my life, my current role at NMSU provides really very limited opportunities to interact directly with undergraduate or graduate students. But there's some phenomenal opportunities, even this podcast right now, where you can have an indirect impact. When I say phenomenal, I mean, I'm right now supporting an entire university system of a main campus, these 4 community colleges, along with the New Mexico Department of Agriculture. And all those components have a core purpose and a mission of empowering students and other constituents. And I advise their senior leaders on matters of law. Now, before joining NMSU, I had less seniority at other universities, such as University of Hartford, Idaho State, and Texas Southern University. But I had more opportunities there than I do now to have some formal and informal dialogue with students. What I typically did, I attended all kinds of campus activities where we bump into each other, casual chats, walking across campus, and also sharing the campus gym, sharing the campus cafeterias. Now, some of that dialogue sometimes will blossom into mentoring scenarios, and some of those continue even right now. I'll take my prior role at the University of Hartford as one example. At the University of Hartford, I participated on a panel presentation to students, faculty, and staff on the topic of free speech on campus. I also served as a speaker to at least one joint meeting at that university of what they call Brothers and Sisters United, which was formerly known as Black Student Union, and also the Caribbean American Student Association. I spoke to them on some legal topics that relate to racial profiling. I also once gave a brief talk to a group of students who were about to view the historic movie called Red Tails about the Tuskegee Airmen. And I shared with them some firsthand stories that my own parents had shared with me about those airmen. Now, at these other universities, several members of the faculty also from time to time would invite me to present class lectures on topics ranging from law to higher education diversity. Now, another example is from the first ever experience I had working in higher ed, and that was at Texas A&M University. At that time, I had just recently completed graduate school, and so I understood what they were going through as grad students, and I became an informal advisor to the Black Graduate Student Association and the African Student Association.
Thanks, Mr. Collins. So you bring to mind one of the sole purposes of doing this is because hidden gems like yourself, students may not even know that you're here. And so one of the reasons that we're doing this podcast is so that we can connect students with Black faculty and staff on our campus, as well as other as well as others. But I think that it's extremely important for a sense of community for students to know that there is a Black attorney on our campus that maybe could serve as a mentor to them, in addition to all of the amazing faculty and staff that we have. You mentioned the Tuskegee Airmen, and I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but Mr. Clayton Flowers, who is 105 years old, lives here in Las Cruces, and he is one of the original Tuskegee Airmen. So if you ever have an opportunity to meet him, he is an active member of the NAACP. So if you ever have an opportunity to meet him, I hope that you get that opportunity.
I would look forward to it.
Thinking about your career, what would you say has been the most significant achievement that you have accomplished?
Well, one of them is just staying current, staying involved. There are so many different things, different eras and different phases of your life, and things that will impress you different ways. And I can tell you, sometimes you can look backwards and say, well, that was a pretty cool thing that happened. At the time, it doesn't seem that way. You're too busy being part of it. But I can say I've enjoyed certain real experiences. One of those experiences came after, it was in the late 1980s. And that was after there had been a major disaster with the space shuttle. It was a Challenger incident in 1986. And I ended up going back into the engineering field even after I finished law school, and I was helping get the space shuttle back going again. And one of the most exciting things was seeing the space shuttle back, operational after quite a long time, where you had to, do a lot of engineering tests to make sure that no one else was going to die anytime soon. That was pretty exciting, and there was national attention. Even the President of the United States came and wanted to share in that celebration. I looked right outside the window where I worked and saw his limousine passing. I just thought that was a pretty good thing at the time. That was an exciting moment. And there have been other ones. Some of the things we do don't get that kind of press, but you're involved with a lot of critical activities with other people, and you form good relationships. And so I would just say those relationships probably mean as much as anything else. When I was at Chrysler Corporation, it was nice to have been working as an attorney, and I was representing not only Chrysler, but also Ford and General Motors in some consortia that they were doing. And, it created a profile. I was actually able to be profiled in Black Enterprise magazine because they were interested in the program I was working on. So they featured me and two other African-American people who were involved in this cooperative research program. So that was pretty exciting. So that's again on the side of things being good experiences, but there's been many more, and hopefully there's more to come.
That's incredible. Thank you for that. So you mentioned the importance of networking, and I want to get your perspective on that. So from students and young professionals in general, how would you advise them to go about networking, building those connections and building up their careers, so that way when they need something or when they're looking for resources, they can have access to that through networking?
Well, networking is a topic that's near and dear to me. In the 1990s, I was exposed to a book called Success Runs in Our Race. And it was written by a gentleman, his name is George Fraser. And this was before the World Wide Web had been rolled out. Networking at that time was person to person. You went to conventions and you went to after hours activities, you passed out your card. But I learned from George Fraser the importance of being known as a giver. Now, networking is a situation where a lot of people go into it with something that they want to get. But as in the rest of life, givers and takers show themselves out. If you're known as a taker, people will tend to avoid you. If you're known as a giver, people will tend to welcome you. So whether you're doing it online, in person, or otherwise, you should be very intentional on being a giver. Find situations where people have a common interest with you and find out what you can contribute to it. Now, again, you have to learn that what you have is valuable, and you also have to be self-aware enough to know what you don't know. But here's the deal. As long as you're giving, people are going to pour into you. All right. What does that mean? That means volunteering. That means getting involved in community activities. If you're a student, there are plenty of campus activities. And if you can spare a moment from your studies, get involved and do some volunteering. One thing, when I was at Chrysler Corporation, we had a mentoring environment there, the African American attorneys, we call it the Chrysler African American Network. And one of the more senior people in that organization was encouraging us to go do some community volunteering. He said, look, all the big time decision makers get involved in these volunteer activities. You get much more profile there than you can on your job. Okay, so I tried it out, and it's absolutely true. When you get involved in volunteer activities, you will find that there are folks who are very talented and oftentimes very powerful. And you get a chance to do some things in their presence. You learn from them, but they also see what you're doing. Many of them will contact you later. So networking, it's a lifetime pursuit. It's something you want to do as much as you can. You can do it on the most local level. You can do it on campus here in the city of Las Cruces, in Doña Ana County, state of New Mexico, the Southwest region, the United States, planet Earth. You can do it wherever you can find some folk. What's the whole deal? You find out someone who's interested in something that you're generally interested in. And then the second thing, you find out what it is that you can offer, and you continue to do that. Amazingly, things will happen in your favor.
I agree wholeheartedly. And I have, since stepping into this role, actually the way I was able to connect to this role was that in 2015, when I moved to New Mexico, Black Programs was the first place before I even unpacked, was the very first place that I came to volunteer. So I absolutely agree with you wholeheartedly on that. And we have tried to make that a staple of our program. We have had the students going over. We've adopted Lynn Community Middle School. And so we've taken students over to volunteer there in the summer for the food banks, and even going over to serve as near peer mentors for some of the students over there. So thank you for that. Speaking of mentoring, what would you say, and another aspect of why we're doing this podcast is to serve as a bird's eye view for people who are interested in joining NMSU, maybe as a faculty person, as a staff person, or even as a student. And so can you speak to those individuals who are interested in calling NMSU home?
Well, as we've mentioned before, this is probably one of the most welcoming environments I've ever been in. And, I've lived in Chicago, I've lived in the Detroit area, I've lived in Hartford, Connecticut, I've lived in Pocatello, Idaho, Houston, Texas, Fort Worth, Texas, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I've never been a place that was as welcoming. So you have a built-in advantage right there. Why do you want to be here? Because it's a place where people can love on you. Now, I didn't say they're going to be all over you, but I'm going to say that people can love on you. You can find a niche, you can do some things. There's plenty going on. The university system is sort of redefining itself. We have bold new leadership here. We're taking on some programs that you probably may not have had a chance to get to in some other places. We're doing them. One thing interested me, if you can tell from my aerospace background, when I found out that there was a spaceport just a few miles away from here, that was exciting to me because that tells me a whole lot about what's going on here. We're at a place where new things are happening, and yet we have tremendous tradition. And there's all the tradition. If you go to Mesilla and you find out all the things that go on there, tremendous amount of tradition. So you can anchor to either one of those, way into the future or pull yourself into all the heritage there. The other thing is just, I think there's just an environment where if you have an idea, someone's interested in seeing if you can run with it. And there's this idea in some other places they call not invented here. Well, I think it's just the opposite here. There's a whole lot of invention and reinvention, and you might even want to reinvent yourself while you're here.
Thank you. As a follow-up to that, what would you say, we represent, as Black people, we represent less than 2% of the population here. So definitely an opportunity to recreate yourself in a totally different space. So what would you say has been the most significant contribution or milestone of African Americans / Blacks?
Interesting question. Well, milestones. I look at eras and years. We can look at the year 1619 in Jamestown, Virginia, as a traditional start, of our enslavement experience here. We can look at 1865 in terms of the end of that experience, in terms of it being still legal. But for me, it's still 1954 when the Brown versus Board US Supreme Court decision came down. It's so significant because it directly outlawed racial discrimination in schools. But it wasn't just about schools, because it became binding legal precedent and setting in motion a dismantling that's been going on for decades of government enforced apartheid in the United States. That dismantling is still going on today. We're still trying to figure out, where are some safe spaces for us just to be ourselves, just to be human. So a lot is still happening. And I think the jury is still out on how much it was going to accomplish, but I can't think of anything since 1954 that has been as significant as a milestone.
Thanks for that. And so I just want to draw on your background there, those books you have behind you. And so this is a two-part question. One, what would you say is your favorite quote and its significance? And then what is your favorite book?
Okay. Well, my favorite quote comes from the late 18th century, and it's attributed to several different people. I won't make a choice, but you can look it up yourself. The quote is, "Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty." Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. We're living through some turbulent times, and these times are a stark reminder that you can't rest on your laurels. Now, too many of us misinterpreted the political meaning of the Obama presidency as being a confirmation that this country had become post-racial. Now, that outlook shows that we have a disconnect from the painful lessons that our ancestors learned. My generation grew up in a society that was discarding officially sanctioned racism. Now, when some of us became parents, we got focused on sending our kids to all kinds of enrichment activities, whether it be soccer leagues, dance class, and math camp, and all of that was good. But without a clear plan, many of us focused on our kids' ability to enjoy the fruits of this society's opportunities, whether occupational, social, or otherwise. But a lot of us failed to pass on the lessons that our own parents passed on to us about living in a world that was fanatically hostile to us as a people. As a matter of survival, our foreparents were consistently drilled on the how-tos and whys of engaging with white Americans and other ethnic groups. My parents, who grew up in the 1930s and 1940s, drilled my siblings and me. The elders in my neighborhood did the same thing to all the young folks who they saw in the neighborhood. You know the saying, it takes a village to raise a child. Now, even the kids in my generation during my childhood made it their business to challenge one another on their awareness of the cause of Black freedom. One major cost for what we now call progress is that we discarded much of that village. Without the village, we miss out on some critical conversations in our homes, in our neighborhoods that confront and educate about the scourge of racism. Now, the result is that a lot of our young adults are unprepared emotionally, spiritually, and intellectually to deal with blatant expressions of racism, and they're having a tough time. Our next generations need a plan to navigate a world that's still as hostile as ever, with little understanding or concern about social equity. So in 2021, eternal vigilance means more than just being woke. It means being emotionally, physically, intellectually, and spiritually prepared for the worst. It means being so tuned into the business at hand that the society has no other choice than to pay attention or get out the way. Vigilance can come with joy. We can still be fun-loving and able to live, love, and create and reinvent ourselves. But all of that is most likely to happen if first we've laid a strong foundation of wise steps and awareness.
Wow, that was powerful. I wonder if you could talk about that notion of woke, because I think you hit on something very poignant, which is I think that in today's society, young people consider being woke, the protests and all of that has its place. But what would you say, as for Black programs and other entities and allies, how can we help young people that are on the front lines to do just those things that you have mentioned?
Well, it's a combination of things, and it's not just one. Uh, where we want to be aware, we want to know what's going on. We need to know how to describe a social ill and describe it clearly enough. But beyond that, we have to have solutions. We have to have some successes that we can build on. We also have to figure out how not to use stringent purity tests on ideology in terms of our own alliances within our community and also outside of our community. That's a game that's been played on of us. We've been convinced that we have to have 100% fidelity with the next person in order to work collaboratively. And that's never going to work because no two people are alike. People who you think are all about the same things you're about, when you really get close, that's not going to be the case. So if that's the truth, when you see something that's obviously not something you agree with, that doesn't mean you shut down. It means you become selective on what you're going to work together on. And you do that. And you find whatever you can positive about that situation and you reinforce that. In other words, you feed the positive, you don't feed the negative. You don't spend all your time on stuff you disagree with. At some point, somebody's going to disappoint you, but that's okay because none of us is perfect. And trust me, I'm not perfect. You're not perfect. And if we can just get past that issue, we can deal in the world of imperfection. But what do? You just try to do your best. You try to do your best. If somebody messed up yesterday, you find out if that person wants to be rehabilitated and you can reconcile with them on something. Some people, they want to be, as unreconciled as possible. I can't talk about those folks, but most of us are willing to do something constructive. Our ancestors, believe it or not, didn't all agree with one another, but they found common ground. And that's the power that we need to pass on. We need to continue to find some common ground and move forward.
Thank you so much for that. And I really appreciate you've given a lot of wisdom and knowledge that can really apply to a lot of people from very different walks of life. So I appreciate hearing that. Just to get ready to wrap up and take things down a little more casual path, would you mind sharing a fun fact or story about yourself?
Sure.
Something lighthearted.
All work and no play makes Roy a dull guy. Now, during my grade school years, no one mistook me as being a cool dude. It didn't help that I was very much a band nerd who played tuba and sousaphone. After high school, I got very involved in the world of Black Greek life on campus, doing everything from stomping at step shows with fraternity brothers to partying like there was no tomorrow. Now, of course, my grades suffered because engineering professors don't indulge foolishness. And only by God's grace did I get back on track and obtain multiple college degrees and professional credentials. How about that?
I think great. You had a fun time. So just one final question. Are there any other comments or words of wisdom that you have for students?
Sure. Now you'll notice that I keep saying that we all have to take our power. Take our power. Optimism is a valuable tool, but we need to prepare not only for success, but also as if we're going to face opposition and adversity. And that this means having an action plan, or more realistically, a set of plans A, B, and C. That's because nobody knows what the future holds. So if all we have is plan A, we can end up very frustrated if most or all of the plan A elements fall apart. Think of this pandemic as an example. We can't pretend that it never happened. We can't wish it away. We can't get back to 2019 when no one had heard of the coronavirus. We've all learned the hard way how important it is to be ready to adjust to doing something that we would not have done before. If by doing it, it'll keep us sane, keep us well, and keep us moving. Now, one benefit of the experience of trying out new approaches is that we will end up experiencing things that we never would have had an opportunity to discover without losing access to some things that we're accustomed to. So that kind of change either strengthens our commitment to getting back to plan A, or it teaches us that plan B isn't so bad after all. The way we know what to shoot for is to be honest with ourselves about what we're trying to do and why. That means evaluating through trial and error whether the primary goal that we associated with plan A is really worthwhile. Now, if that goal stands the test of time, we can always focus our energies on getting back to that same goal, even if we had to spend some time with a little bit of plan B or even some of plan C. But not everything worthwhile comes to us immediately. Sometimes we're not yet ready for what we call success to even happen, because some success really comes with a cost. Everyone who I've ever known about who is considered successful has run into some painful obstacles. Now, on the flip side, if it's too easy, if it looks too good to be true, that might be a sign that something is not quite right. So finally, you'll notice that I've also mentioned God's grace. That's something that each one of us has to recognize in our own way. But my experience with God's grace is that it's not really about me, and it's really not about you. It's about God's purposes in you. Everybody has a purpose. We have to study that purpose and do all that's within our power to be ready for the challenges and the opportunities that come with that purpose. And when it finally takes place, when you finally get to that end spot, you'll know that it's really not about us. But after all the hard work, all the waiting and all the detours, it's an amazing thing to see God's grace in action.
Thank you so much, Mr. Collins. I have to say that you are not a typical lawyer, a lawyer that at least that I have experienced. You're very down to earth, and so I'm grateful for that. I would like to ask, as we are coming to the official close, if we have some aspiring engineers on our campus, we have some aspiring attorneys on our campus, how can they best reach you? Can you provide them with an email address? Certainly.
We have an email address. It's called gencounsel@nmsu.edu. Gencounsel, GENCOUNSEL @nmsu.edu. And it will get to me. We have other ways as well. And I would encourage you to use informal channels too. Some that know Ms. York, some that know Mr. Alvarado. Find some informal channels. Everybody who says that they're busy can always make a little time, but please respect those who are very busy, because we are very busy.
Thank you so much for that. And so with that being said, I think that you have given us all a lot of food for insight, a lot of things that we can just sit and marinate. I know that I personally will be replaying this over and over, because you dropped a lot of significant nuggets that I'm going to be taking and applying for myself. And so with that being said, I would like to thank everyone for tuning in to another episode of Black Excellence in Higher Education with our General Counsel, Mr. Roy Collins. And I invite you to return next week as we sit down with our very own Jordan Summers, who is one of the event coordinators over in Corbett. I would also invite you to visit blackprograms.nmsu.edu to get involved, to stay informed, and to get some enlightenment about Black History Month events that we are hosting. And I always like to end with a note, a quote that I absolutely love from Cesar Chavez, which simply says that preservation of one's own culture does not mean disrespect or disregard for other cultures. With that being said, thanks for joining in, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.